Our topic today is the notion of ordinary psychosis. Ordinary psychosis is a concept that's been developed by Jacques-Alain Miller, Lacan's son-in-law, and it draws attention to a variety of clinical phenomena that we could say broadly fit within the domain of psychosis. So we'll spend a little bit of time focusing on Jacques-Alain Miller's paper, which was published in the Psychoanalytic Notebooks. This paper is entitled Ordinary Psychosis Revisited, and it was published in 2009, which is more than a decade after Jacques-Alain Miller had initially proposed the concept. So we'll spend a little bit of time looking at that paper and see how he describes it and what is the utility of this concept. We should note from the outset that it's a concept, you could say, that is still under revision, that there's some debate about it, there's some critique of it, there's questions about how it could best be utilized. But it seems to me helpful also to start with two basic descriptions or definitions. And I say that because as we begin looking at the Jacques-Alain Miller paper, we'll see that in many ways his attempt was actually to provide a very sketchy, somewhat open-ended definition of a concept such that multiple people could play some part in contributing, in thinking it through, and assigning certain clinical phenomena to this concept. So we will look at two brief descriptions. We'll quickly take one description that comes from a Russell Grigg paper. The Russell Grigg paper was published in this Clinic Culture, We're All Mad Here, which is edited by Jacques-Alain Miller and Mary Janus. And interestingly enough, and this will give us a first indication of how the concept is being utilized and its potential efficacy, Russell Grigg's contribution to this volume is called Treating the Wolfman as a Case of Ordinary Psychosis. So we see right there how ordinary psychosis is now a concept that's being utilized to consider some older and canonical cases within psychoanalysis, in the history of psychoanalysis. What then is ordinary psychosis? Russell Grigg says the following. The term ordinary psychosis was introduced by Jacques-Alain Miller in 1997. It refers to a form of psychosis in which the subject does not manifest any of the classical psychotic symptoms, such as delusions, hallucinations, and bodily phenomena of various kinds, but manifests itself rather in a mild form in which the symptoms are often quite discrete. So already there, we have a couple of ideas. This is a mild form of psychosis. And here, let's stress something which might seem almost completely counterintuitive to people coming to this topic from outside of a Lacanian framework. This is a mild form of psychosis which may be manifest in the absence of classical psychotic symptoms, such as delusions, hallucinations, and bodily phenomena. So let's just stress that. For many of us, many colleagues, the idea that you may have something akin to a mild psychosis which manifests without obviously noisy, traditional sounding forms of symptomatology, that sounds odd. But this is precisely what we're looking at. Mild form of psychosis where the subject does not manifest classical psychotic symptoms. Okay, that's what Russell Grigg has to say. Let's now look at another definition. We're going to get this from Jonathan Redmond's excellent book, Ordinary Psychosis and the Body. He will give us a lot of various descriptions of ordinary psychosis, and he will also give us an important argument as to why ordinary psychosis becomes a necessary Lacanian response, particularly in relationship to the notion of borderline, which Lacanian psychoanalysis, as is pretty well known, dismisses, rejects as inadequate. How does he define ordinary psychosis? Well, on page 4 of his book, he says ordinary psychosis refers to mild psychosis. Originally, the term was established to create a forum for discussing difficult to classify cases. Difficult cases emerge when the signs, symptoms, and the course of illness do not follow the typical presentation of either a neurosis or a psychosis. Ordinary psychosis is currently a focal point for debates addressing issues such as diagnosis, psychiatric nosology, and the neurosis-psychosis distinction, untriggered psychosis, and the onset of psychosis and subsequent triggering events. So interestingly here, once again, we have an emphasis on the mild dimension mild psychosis, but he also wants to suggest that the whole notion of ordinary psychosis presents a kind of forum or a space to question, to consider, to explore a variety of related questions, not only pertaining to the distinction between psychosis and neurosis, but also questions dealing with an untriggered psychosis. And he emphasizes a couple of things, 3 points, which we'll hear time and again in talk of ordinary psychosis. The onset of psychosis, the triggering of more apparent and manifest forms of psychosis or psychotic symptoms potentially, and stabilization. And those 3 things, onset, triggering, stabilization, get repeated time and again, so much so that we could say that the notion of ordinary psychosis is really drawing clinicians' attention to these 3 areas, with the hope that not only one might explore the onset, try to get a better sense of what might be a triggering event, but fundamentally also what one might be able to do to enable a greater form of stabilization. So those 3 ideas are pretty crucial. Right. Once again, we have in Redmond's description an emphasis that the typical presentation, the typical signs and symptoms of psychosis may not be apparent in this mild form of psychosis. Very good. So let us now turn to Jacques-Alain Miller's presentation of some of these issues. The paper, as I've already mentioned, is called Ordinary Psychosis Revisited, and lots of interesting facets to his description, but let's pay a little bit of attention to how he describes the invention or the development of the concept. So fairly early on in his paper, he says, Jacques-Alain Miller, I didn't invent a concept with ordinary psychosis, I invented a word. I invented an expression. I intentionally gave a very sketchy definition to attract various meanings, various shades of meanings around the signifier. His idea then is that he didn't want to, as it were, overly rigidly define it because his assumption was it works much more productively to give a kind of rather open-ended sort of space of debate, such that a variety of difficult to consider cases end up being presented, that there's more debate, there's more collaboration and contribution to what this concept might mean. Now that sounds pretty useful. It sounds psychoanalytic. He says that he takes his inspiration in that move from how Jacques Lacan thought about the past, a kind of underdefined concept that meant that it wasn't easy simply to mimic and everybody would now say my analysis is finished because I did the past precisely as was defined. So there's something useful about an underdefined concept, but of course we could also argue that there's also something somewhat limiting and potentially problematic about an underdefined concept, particularly one that is going to be used in a diagnostic domain. So as we move forward, we'll try to get a sense both of what he wants to say in terms of differential diagnosis, the limitations in a way of a binary clinic. So we'll say a little bit more of that. But it's also important to pay attention to his own remarks and qualifications, such as when he says that the notion of ordinary psychosis is not, as it were, a diagnostic category, but is rather something akin to an epistemic category, which is a point we've been trying to stress a couple of times. So he gives us this dilemma. He says, for a long time in the Lacanian field and the Freudian field, you could say we have had a binary clinic. What does that mean? A binary clinic in this respect means that you've got neurosis or you've got psychosis. Now, of course, you could say, well, what about perversion? And he does make a brief note. He says, we have this either or, an absolute either or situation if you've got a binary clinic of neurosis or psychosis. He says, well, you could also say that we had perversion, but it wasn't quite the same thing. Here's the quote, because true perverse subjects don't really analyze themselves. So what you have in analysis are subjects with perverse traits. Perversion is a questionable term which has been put into disarray by a series of historical movements. And I guess he means here LGBTQT. And he goes on to say, and so tends to be a discarded category. So that's another lecture all on its own right, what to do with this concept of perversion. Is it indeed a discarded category? And here he seems to be suggesting it's not something that gets in the way of thinking about the predominant issue, the predominant problem, how to get a sense of the limitations of a binary clinic. What do we mean by this? Well, with an either-or binary clinic, let's put it this way. Differential diagnosis would work best, and perhaps does work best, if in working with someone, one has both a series of indications that this is, for example, a neurosis, and also a series of indications that it is definitively not psychosis. So in other words, you've got support both of a positive sort, indications that it is a neurosis, and also indications where it fails to be a psychosis. But one of the problems that can happen when you've just got neurosis and psychosis is the situation where you say, well, it seems to be pretty obviously not psychosis. Therefore, it's neurosis. Or going the other way around, you could say, well, this is definitively not a neurosis as far as I can see, so therefore it must be psychosis. Now, Jacques-Alain Miller's reasoning here is that that's not enough because, in a sense, you're just using a series of nots. It's not this, it's not this, it's not this, hence it must by default be that. And he goes on in the paper to make a very clear point, and maybe we'll stress that right now, as to say, if you are dealing with, or if you think you are dealing with an instance of neurosis, you need to have definitive evidence that it's neurosis. Neurosis is not something that we can just assume as a default category that most people who will knock on our door to come and see us, to consult with us, occupy. So in fact, let's note that point right away. He says this is a little bit further on. He says, neurosis is a peculiar structure. I think he's also suggesting it's a particular structure. And it's not something that you can assume by default is in existence because there's a lack of psychotic features. Neurosis is a very definite structure, he says. If you don't recognize the very definite structure of neurosis in the patient, you can bet, or you can have to try to bet, that it might indeed be a dissimulated psychosis. It's a veiled psychosis. So it's not sure that ordinary psychosis is an objective category. So let's just go a little bit slowly here. He's saying is neurosis is not the wallpaper, which is an interesting way, I think, of suggesting that it's not some default category. When it is neurosis, he says, you have to know. You can't assume it as a default category. But what he's also suggesting is that if you are not able to note and definitively highlight that it is a neurosis, one of the things that you would want to consider, well, psychotic structure is a possibility, but also whether it is a veiled or dissimulated psychosis. So I just want to stress that quickly too. Ordinary psychosis here, we've already seen that in Redmond's terms, we're thinking about a mild psychosis, but now we're finding a slightly different description or a supplementary description, which says that it could be dissimulated. It could be a veiled psychosis, which presumably means that on the surface appearance, the person is holding things together, is managing to do pretty well, that the psychosis is at some level concealed or less than obvious. So just to smuggle that point in there, but back to what he wants to say about neurosis, and also this very interesting qualification about ordinary psychosis. So let's do the latter first. It's not sure that ordinary psychosis is an objective category. Direct quote. He continues, can you say that ordinary psychosis exists objectively in the clinic? It's not sure. Ordinary psychosis concerns your knowledge, your possibility of knowing something about the patient. You say ordinary psychosis when you do not recognize evident signs of neurosis. So you are led to say it is a dissimulated psychosis, a psychosis that is difficult to recognize as such, but which I infer from various small cues. It's more of an epistemic category than an objective category. It concerns our way of knowing it. Now, there's lots to say about that, but let's just let the question resonate. What does it mean that ordinary psychosis should be seen as an epistemic category rather than simply a kind of concrete or objective diagnostic category? And I think there's also the potential danger here that people will hear it as exactly that, another diagnostic category. For me, the question of what it means to be an epistemic category, I think means that one has to constantly ask further questions. Clearly, his first indication is that it's not enough to assume that something is simply not a neurosis and therefore it is a psychosis. one of the questions one would want to ask is, well, is it a dissimulated psychosis? But it means, I think, very importantly, that it's not enough to simply assume, oh, by default, that it's an ordinary psychosis. One would also want to carry on asking questions. He does develop that point a little bit later on, makes two pretty rapid assertions. One is he wants to suggest that whenever there is a psychosis, so long as it's not a form of catatonia, there are some devices, some means, some responses. A suppletion is one word that he would use here, that enable the subject to find a way of dealing with the crises of this psychosis. So there's always some way of responding to it. This is a first important point. But then also to suggest that what the clinician would want to do is to see how people are dealing with these crises and how that might be extended. Let's end then with one further reiteration of this question of neurosis. Because although we're talking about ordinary psychosis, what Jacques-Alain Miller says about neurosis is also very interesting and helpful. A few pages on, he says, okay, one of the consequences of the notion of ordinary psychosis is that it leads us to a refinement of the concept of neurosis. Like I said, neurosis is a peculiar structure. It's not the wallpaper. You need to be able to affirm that this is a neurosis. You need a relationship to the name of the father, not simply any name of the father. That's a distinction we'll look at in a few minutes. You need some proof of castration. You need some proof of a relation to castration, impotence and impossibility. You need, to use the Freudian terms of the second topography, a clear-cut differentiation between ego and id, or between signifiers and drives. You need a clearly delineated superego, and if you don't have this and other signs, well, you don't have a neurosis. You have something else. So let's draw to a close by just suggesting a couple of things. We've tried to, in this short lecture, introduce the concept of an ordinary psychosis. We've linked it to the notion of a mild psychosis. We've also suggested that it is a mild form of psychosis which isn't necessarily characterized or identifiable by loud or obviously psychotic symptoms. Interesting point. We've also wanted to suggest that it is an epistemic category. It's a question, a place where one would want to explore further, to think through, perhaps collaboratively, difficult to conceptualize cases. We've also wanted to suggest that what is crucial here, and this is kind of a big move, we could ask questions about it, is that when we are able to rule out definitively a neurosis, and he wants to suggest you always need to be able to definitively locate a neurosis in terms of the operation of the name of the father, the relationship to castration, a clear-cut differentiation between ego and id. If those things are not to be found, if a neurosis is not to be found, then one of the questions we would then want to consider is this psychosis? Presumably, but also more interestingly, is this a veiled or concealed form of psychosis, which is one way that he is going about this, thinking about this notion of ordinary psychosis. Let's end there.